In this video, we are going to see the backward and compatible changes, or the BC breaks, and the new features that have been introduced in PHP 8.1 starting from PHP 8.0. Down here I have a Docker Compose file where I define two services, PHP 80 and PHP 81. PHP 80 will be running PHP 8.0 CLI, and PHP 81 will be running PHP 8.1 CLI. Down here I have two terminals. I have split my lower screen into two terminals. On the left hand, I'm going to execute this command, which will get me into one of PHP 80's services container. Then I'm going to run PHP-v to check my version, which is PHP 8.0. So in this part of my screen, I'm going to execute scripts under PHP 8.0. And in this part, if I execute the same commands and PHP-v, I'm going to have PHP 8.1. Alright, enough setup. Now let's move on to the backward and compatible changes. The first one will be concerning globals array. In PHP 8.1, writing into globals array with functions like array pop, for example, is no longer supported. So this script over here, which executes array pop on globals, in PHP 8.0 should not provoke an error. We have no error whatsoever. But if you execute the same thing in PHP 8.1, we are going to have an error. That's the first backward and compatible change. The second change is concerning static variable in inherited methods. Say that we have a class A. This class contains a function where this function defines a counter variable that increments this counter variable and return it. Now we are going to have a class B that extends A. If we var dump a counter, we are going to have 1, since our counter starts from 0 and we are incrementing it. If we var dump a counter again, we are going to have 2 in PHP 8.0 and in PHP 8.1, as a matter of fact. Now if we call b counter in PHP 8.0, we are going to have 1. And if we call it again, we are going to have 2, which means that in PHP 8.0, when inheriting a function that has a static variable within, we are creating a new context for this static variable, which is not what a developer would expect. So that's why in PHP 8.1 this got fixed. Let's try and execute this in PHP 8.0. So if I execute this script, I'm going to have 1, 2, and then 1, 2 again. So 1, 2 for a counter, and 1, 2 for b counter and b counter again. In PHP 8.1 we should be having 1, 2, then 3, 4 instead of this 1 and 2 over here. Let's try that out. If we execute this script over here, we are going to have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's the second change. Now the third change is concerning optional parameters before required ones. Let's say that we have a function called make yogurt, and this function takes two parameters. The first is optional, followed by the second, which is required. In PHP 8.0 we can call this make yogurt with the second argument only. We are going to suppose that the first argument, which is optional, will be having a bool value, which is the default value. We are going to have a small warning saying that we should not be doing this, but our code will execute nonetheless. So if you execute this script over here in PHP 8.0, we are going to have making a bowl of raspberry yogurt. So let's try that out. As I said, we have a small warning message, but nonetheless we have this script executing. Now in PHP 8.1 this will no longer be the case, even if we are calling our parameter with named parameter. So let's try that out. If I execute the same script, I'm going to have an error saying, I'm going to have an argument error actually saying that the argument container is not passed, even though we are defining a default value for this argument over here. So in PHP 8.1, an optional argument followed by a required argument is considered a required argument, and we should provide a value for it even with the named parameters. That's the change number 3. Change number 4 is read only and never keywords. In the new features, just in a moment, we are going to see that we have two new keywords added to PHP 8.1, which are read only and never. That means that they are no longer available for end developers to be used in userland code, except for read only, which can be used as a function, but for interfaces, classes, traits, etc., read only and never are no longer available. The last change is concerning resources. There is a movement in PHP to change all resources into objects. So a lot of functions like FTP, LDAP, fail info, etc., are now migrating from resources to objects. Let's take, for example, this small script over here. We are connecting to a FTP server in PHP 8.0. We are going to have a resource for this FTP connect callback. So if I execute this code over here, I'm going to have a resource in our FTP call, but in PHP 8.1, I'm going to have an object instead of that resource. Alright, now let's move on to the new features. The first new feature is the explicit octal literal prefix. In PHP 8.0 and below, we did have an explicit literal prefix for binary and hexadecimal values, but for octal values, we didn't have that. We considered that if we start with 0, it is implicitly considered as an octal notation. Now in PHP 8.1, we have this literal over here, which will indicate to PHP to interpret this in octal base. The second change is for array unpacking for string case. In PHP 8.1, we can now unpack an array even if it has string keys. Previously, this was not possible. If we execute this script in PHP 8.0, we are going to have an error saying that we cannot unpack array with string keys. But in PHP 8.1, this restriction got removed and we can do this unpacking. The third change is for named arguments after argument unpacking. In PHP 8.0, calling this unpacking thing before named argument was not possible. If we execute this script in PHP 8.0, we are going to have an error saying that cannot combine named arguments and argument unpacking in PHP 8.0. Now, if we execute the same script in PHP 8.1, we are going to have this working without errors. Alright, change number 4. If you are coming from another programming language, enumerations is a feature that is missing in PHP. So it got introduced in PHP 8.1 finally. For those of you who don't know what enumerations are for, they are simply a way to provide a closed set of possible values for a type. So if I want to modularize, for example, a suit, I can define it in enumeration where I can have 4 possible values: clubs, diamonds, hearts, and spades. So this is the syntax for defining enumeration. Now my enumeration can be used in any place where I have type hinting. Let's say, for example, I want to define a function called pick a card. I can provide as a parameter a variable suit of type suit. Now I can call my pick a card with this value over here that contains suit diamonds. I can call it also with suit spades directly, but what I can't call it with is the string representation of one of these values over here and the string value of one of the values that I have. So if I call it with this symbol over here, this string representation of spades, I'm going to have an error saying that this argument is of type string and not of type suit. So I can call my function only with this syntax over here. This is a very brief overview of enums. If you want to have more details on the subject, feel free to check out the documentation. They are doing an extensive work on the subject. Change number 5 consists of the introduction of a new way to define callable. Let's say that I want to define a callable for strlen in a variable called fn. The old way to do it is using closure from callable and then provide the callable as argument. This callable can be a simple string if you have a function, or an array containing the object and the method if it is a method of an object, or the class and then the method if it is a static class. So we can define a callable using closure from callable, or this new syntax over here, which is calling the function name with this special argument, which is 3 dots over here. The same goes for a method of an object. We will be calling the object, then the method, and provide again as argument 3 dots over here. And finally, it's almost the same thing for static functions by providing the class, then the method, and again having 3 dots as argument for the method. So line 3 is equivalent to line 4, line 7 is equivalent to line 8, and line 10 is equivalent to line 11. Change number 6 is intersection types. In PHP 8.0, we have seen the union types. This is kind of the opposite of that. So if you have a value that is the intersection between iterator and countable, that means that our value should be both of type iterator and of type countable. If you have iterator union countable, our value could be iterator, could be countable, or both. So for intersection, we have to have our value being both the types that construct the intersection. Like that, if we define a function called count and iterate, and for this function we are going to call for each and count on this parameter, we should be sure that our parameter is both iterator, because we are going to for each on it, and countable, because we are going to call count on the parameter. So that's for intersection types. The change number 7 is the introduction of never return type. If the return type of a function redirect over here is never, that means that within this function we are going to either exit or throw a new exception. If we return a value, then this return never over here is no more valid. So if I call my function redirect with a parameter, I am sure 100% that all the statements after this function over here will not be reachable and will not be executed. So my call to redirect over here will be the last call in my script. Even PHP Storm over here will be telling me that this statement is unreachable. Now you should be careful if you define never for a function, and within this function you are not calling an explicit return. PHP will consider this as an error. Why? Because for PHP, if we don't explicitly return a value, then it is considering that this function will be returning a mixed value. So returning a mixed value and defining this function as returning never is conflicting, and therefore PHP will be telling me a never returning function must not return. As we said, never is a return type, so defining a parameter of type never is not possible in PHP. Also, defining a property of a class as of type never is not possible, and also never cannot be used in union types. So this definition over here, string union never, is not possible in PHP. You might be asking why the introduction of never, because you have void that looks a lot like never, but there is a small difference between void and never, because void allows calling return without an explicit value. However, calling return is not allowed at all in a never declared functions. Another cool feature that have been introduced in PHP 8.1 is the new initializers. Let's say that I have a class called test81. Within this class, I depend on a logger. This logger can be nullable. If I have null passed for me as argument in the constructor, I want to have new null logger instance. So this code over here is equivalent to this code in PHP 8.0, meaning that I am defining a logger. This logger will be having null as default value, and then within the constructor itself, I'm going to test if my logger is null, then I'm going to create a new instance. Otherwise, I'm going to take the logger passed for me as argument. So thanks to PHP 8.1, we can now use the new in the constructor. We can also use it in attributes and other places, which is interesting. This makes the actual default value less obvious, and we are having now a public API more obvious, because in the constructor itself, we are seeing that if no value is provided, we are going to have this new value over here. Rather, in PHP 8.0, we are doing that in the body of the constructor, which is less obvious. Now, if I call my class test81 with a new logger instance, the initializer will not be called. If I call it without argument over here, we are going to have the initializer called, and this new null logger will be passed instead. That's change number 8. Change number 9 is final class constants. Let's have a look at this use case. Let's say I have an interface A that defines a public constant called x. This x will be having I as value. Now, if I have a class C that will be implementing my interface I, and I want to redefine a value for my constant x with bar, I'm not going to be able to do that in PHP 8.0. Let's try that out. If I execute this code, I'm going to have an error saying cannot inherit previously inherited or override constant x. Now, let me comment this code, and I'm going to do something interesting. Instead of implementing directly my interface I, I'm going to introduce a third class. So I'll be having my interface I that contains the constant x as usual, then a second class C that will be implementing I, and finally a third class D that will be extending C. So I have introduced C in the middle between my class D and my interface I, And now I can redefine my constant x to d. So this code will be working and I will be having d as value for my constant x, which is kind of weird. Let's try that out. If I execute my code again, I'm going to have d. Notice that previously I was not able to do that and I had this error over here. So the fix in PHP 8.1 is the introduction of final keyword in constants. Let's say that I have a class called foo. Within this class foo, if I want this constant x to be final and not overridden by my children classes, I will define it as final. So this code over here will be telling me in PHP 8.1 that x could not be redefined because it is declared as final. Let's try that out. And we have an error saying that bar x cannot override final constant foo x. And that's thanks to this final keyword over here. Now I'm going to command this code and see my last case, which is going to summarize both cases where I have final and I don't have final. Let's say that I have an interface I. This interface will be defining a public constant x that contains I, and then a second constant called y, but this time it is final, that will be containing I. Now in a class C that implements my interface I, if I redefine x, I will be able to do that because my constant is not declared final. But if I want to redefine my constant y, I'm going to have an error saying that overriding y is not possible. Let's try that out. If I execute my script, I'm going to have an error saying cannot override final constant y. If I comment this code over here, I'm going to have no trouble, and let's var dump the value of c and then x. We should be having c as value because it will be overridden by this line over here. Let's try that out, and we have c for value. So the rule of thumb over here is that if we have final, we can no longer override constant values. If we don't have that, we are free to override that without the need of introduction of a third class. In PHP 8.1, all this weird behavior got fixed and cleared out. The last change is actually a modifier that got introduced in PHP 8.1. It is called read-only. So a read-only attribute is an attribute that will be assigned only once. After this assignment, all the assignment of this attribute will be rejected and will trigger an error. So let's say that I have this property over here that will be declared as read-only in my class test. I can assign a value to my property through the constructor. So this assignment over here is legal, but then if I want to assign a value, even if it's the same value to my property, I'm going to have an error saying that I cannot modify a read-only property. Let's test this code out. Let's run this code. So I had foobar as output for this var dump over here, which means that I was able to initialize my read-only property through the constructor with foobar value. That's why this var dump is giving me foobar. But then in line 18, I'm going to have an error saying I cannot modify a read-only property. That's it for this video. I will be asking some questions as usual to help you take some information about what we have seen so far. Thank you for watching and see you in other videos to come.